Happy Friday, and so we're live streaming again. We live streamed last week with we had 500 people register, 100 people at the peak off across YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. So we were picking up all the channels. We're doing the same today because we wanted to introduce or at least have a discussion about what I genuinely believe is going to be this year's big talking point, and maybe by H2 this year, the biggest item that everyone's going to be talking about around AI assurance. So I pulled in the man, the legend, Paul Gerrard. And, I'm going to start off with, we did a book, and I should have grabbed it before we started this session, on digital assurance pocketbook, which must be coming to 10 years. He's going to go and get a copy. That's the great thing about it being live. And it actually had the foreword written by myself, and Paul introduced, I think, the concept, and we can see a live version here.
Is that
Of
focus?
It is, yeah. It is the legitimate version.
It's my copy, so I've doodled all over it.
So someone did read a good copy. I've got a few copies behind me. But, your talk last week kind of introduced, dropped the bomb on DeepSeek. We're going to keep that one away from the trending topics. But we're, it introduced some of the principles of assurance, right? And so I posted a snippet of you, a 3-minute video on the LinkedIn channel with you talking and at least explaining what assurance is, right? And I know we kind of definitely saw eye to eye back 10 years ago when you were doing that pocketbook around digital assurance. And I think digital assurance was all accomplishing machine learning, big data in those days, predictive analytics, IoT, and beyond. And it was a long time before we've seen this kind of generative AI rush, and we've seen this AI supremacy run for the market with DeepSeek and everyone else. So, talk a little bit first about digital assurance or just assurance, and then let's try and get, for the listeners, let's try to get to the bottom of, well, what does AI assurance or AI assure actually mean, and why is it important that you guys know about it, and also some of the legislation that's coming in across the European Union, the UK government, and of course the Biden's executive orders last year, which have now started rolling out in the US. So, Paul, assurance, what is it?
Okay, good question. It's not well defined, firstly, and it is a challenge to explain it to people who aren't experienced in projects, in testing, in risk management, and so on. So it's targeted. Let's say, like if you're selling an assurance service, and we've got in mind to do something similar to that, although that's what we're trying to formulate right now. You could say that every project should have some form of a strategy for testing, let's say. Now, on that basis, you need to consider what the goals of the project are, what the risks of the project are, the technicalities, the architecture, the personnel, the organisation, responsibilities, all that other good stuff that goes together to say, how are we going to figure out where we are when we're making progress in our projects? And that's what really testing is about, is to provide information, an information service. Now, let's say you have a strategy on the table. Assurance is to say not just that you're following a strategy, like a series of box ticking exercises. It's about actively engaging with the people who are taking part in the project to say, and to remind them and to potentially coach them, let's say, to say, are you talking to the right people to get your requirements? Are your reviews of the requirements, are you acting on the changes that people are suggesting? Are you looking at the impact of changes to requirements? Are you talking to the developers about how they're doing unit testing, and so on and so forth? So it's like an ongoing conversation from the perspective of someone who is kind of skeptical, let's say. That's too crude a word to put on it, but you're there to help the project keep it on track. So it's you're kind of a coach who takes a kind of skeptical attitude and then says, well, how are you dealing with this? And how are you dealing with that? So rather than saying, did you produce a test plan? Did you automate your test? Did you do that? you look a bit deeper and say, well, how did you do it? Did you use the right sources of knowledge to come to a conclusion and design your approach to dum-de-dum, whatever it is? So in many respects, in process, you're acting like a skeptical observer come coach. Now, that's not necessarily the only way to do assurance, and that's not complete assurance, because in some ways you're like a guide, a coach, an advisor during the process up to the later stage of testing. But later on, you become a little bit of a policeman and say, look, we had a conversation 6 months ago about how you're going to do this, how you're going to test this feature, how you're going to reduce, look at the performance aspects of the system as the architecture as a whole, the security of this, And so you might have had conversations months earlier, or maybe days earlier in a smaller project. It's the same process. A few days, a few months later, you come back to them and say, like, now, how did you do that? And let's see the evidence that you've produced and whether it makes a case to say the performance is acceptable or not, or the security had some issues, but you fixed them and you've retested and you've revalidated your assumptions about things. So that the stakeholders who are going to make some big decisions late in the project have the information they need to proceed, to say, accept or reject or step back and delay or redesign or whatever the outcomes of these very tough conversations are about. So in a way, the assurance role, I would say, whether it's an individual or a team on a huge project, it would be a team. The role is to keep the trying to keep the stakeholders comfortable that the language coming out of the project is not all technical and they're being blinded by science. So in some ways, you're a bit of a translator. And what does that mean? In other ways, and this was put to me very forcefully by a very senior guy on a $200 million SAP project. He says, your job is to, every 6 weeks we have this drains up program level meeting where the project presents to the board status. And your job, Paul, is to say, and they're not lying. And it's as simple as that, So if they say everything's happy, your job, Paul, is to say, and we can believe that and trust it. Or when they say you're ready to intervene, even at a program level meeting, very late in the day, to say about this list of risks that I raised. So Paul, you've listed some risks. You've raised what might be called assurance notes, which are basically, hold on, guys, something's wrong here. You need to recheck your calculations, or you need to consider this risk we hadn't thought of before. What have you done about it? So sometimes you're involved in the conversation to say, did you explore the risk adequately? Was it a testing or a redesign activity or whatever is required to ameliorate it? And so the question then is the risk addressed satisfactorily? So the stakeholders don't want to get involved in that detailed technical conversation, but they do need someone on their side who's been in those conversations, who can assure the board and say, I gave them some tough tasks to take on to address these risks. They appear to have done them. I've read the documents. I've been in the sign-off meetings. I think we're in the clear. And that's the message that you give to stakeholders. So there's a coaching role. There's a kind of a checking role. You might call it a policing role, but that's a bit abrupt, but you get the idea. There's definitely an advisory role to stakeholders as well as to the project and the techies if you're going to get involved in techie conversations. But the overall plan is to give the stakeholders at their level confidence that they're not being lied to, but also that the information they're given is understandable. And in some ways you act as a little bit of a translator to say, that big risk that we identified last week, well, they've worked really hard day and night. They've got a resolution. They've made a bit of a design change. They've done some good testing. We've got some evidence. Performance figures look good. I think we're in the clear. That's kind of the reassurance that stakeholders need. So you're doing a bit of several things. It's and every project is different. So if you like, a selection of what I've just said is appropriate for different projects. big projects, you do the whole 9 yards. If you're dealing with what was the biggest project we worked on? It was 3.5, no, wait a minute, 1.5 billion pound banking program. And an assurance role there, we only had a partial involvement on one aspect of it. But it's appropriate in very large projects as well as the tiniest projects. The tiniest projects might be you have a weekly meeting with the team and say, how are things going? And you just press them on things that seem to be causing concern and saying, how are you dealing with it? And then you might talk to the product owner and say, we've had a technical discussion today, there's a bit of an issue, it looks like we're on top of it. And you're just kind of acting as a translator. Now, it sounds like you're a middleman there, and in some ways you are. And the product owner might say, well, I could do that for myself. Good, okay, but don't forget to keep paying attention to these conversations where people are saying, we're 90% there. There is warning. If it's 90% there, usually means we've still got 50% to go. With developers, it's a real stereotype and generalization, I know, but you've got to have your ears to the ground in a small project more than in a large project, because large projects tend to communicate with documentation and formality, whereas small projects, it's all word of mouth. You've got to be in those conversations all the damn time, listening, for what's going on. So it's a big topic, but and it's a challenge to do, and a lot of companies, over the years, I've been involved in tiny projects as well as some real monsters, massive projects, and I think it has a role in all of them. But obviously the role scales up or down.
Yeah, I love it. And so, I think, with that example, we're talking about digital assurance, right? Just for a second, just humoring me. And then, so, I'm going to give an example to kind of reiterate. So I always use the exact same example. Large German-based investment bank, £4 billion operational and excellence investment from the organization. So, we had 2,600 systems, which we're providing assurance across there, or test assurance, quality assurance, whatever you want to call it for a second. And it was a massive investment to look at those 2,600 systems across the bank, and then the 10,000 in essence underneath it staff that sit there. I'm just going to say hypothetically for a second, the way I look at it is it's a 1% cost to have that level of assurance across the top, which is nothing, right? Of the total project cost and development, testing, but it's still a big number, right? If you're talking 4 billion, right? Yeah. So part of it is there's a level there for assurance, and I think the reason why we're talking about AI assurance for a bit is we're kind of narrowing the focus for a second from the entire, and I'm not going to use the word digital transformation, but the entire delivery mechanism within your organization, and I'm going to call it the office of the CIO / IT for a second. So that's, IT projects, move all that to a side. What we're seeing now, and I think it's the whole point of kind of what we've heard the last few weeks of last week with the Stargate announcement of 500 billion in AI infrastructure for, investment. And we saw DeepMind wipe $1.2 trillion off the stock exchange, which would have been nice to have would have funded that AI infrastructure. Is there's a large investment in, and I'm going to call it AI, but artificial intelligence, to help, keep, global economies, the GDP of those companies protected, right? So there's also a lot of investment. We heard the Friday conversation with the Blair Institute saying 52% of the UK workforce is at risk of being replaced by AI workforce, right? And so suddenly we're seeing, in essence, AI-based, systems that are aiming to remove human aspects, and I'm going to call it the business. I'm not talking about IT here. We're talking about the business for tasks that don't need to be done, could be done by an AI-based system, right? So there's this huge, investment. I think it'd be hard to kind of argue at this point in time that it's not on the agenda for every organization that is on the planet, right? So, this is let's call it a new role for assuring systems that are doing. And I think the complexity is, in essence, infinitely more complex because of ethical concerns, privacy, trustworthiness, all the stuff that I've done in the past, but also stuff that we're seeing with the ISO 42000 standard coming in, very similar like the quality standards that were there before, which most organizations have that little certificate saying, look, we're doing everything we should be doing in a very CMMI kind of way in the good old days. I think they're also looking at the 42000 to say, this is what we should be doing when we're building and engineering AI infused system. And then obviously yesterday, the UK government made a policy announcement to say that their AI assurance policy, there's 52 organisations in the UK that they think are following these guidelines. I know there's a lot more organisations than that in the UK, so I think it's just like the 42,000 where there's only a handful in the US which are now accredited. It's a small percentage. Let's call it 5% just for argument's sake. 5-10% of people are actually going through and taking AI assurance, and compliance and regulatory change seriously. And then let's talk about today, right? Today is the last day of non-AI assurance globally, because come the 2nd of February, which is Sunday for us, there's the AI ban start coming into force across Europe. So if you operate within Europe, so if you're a vendor that has entities in Europe, then just like GDPR, you'll be required to follow those guidelines, follow those compliances, the legislations that's been set out on the European the AI Act for the EU. Now, let me just explain a little bit about what that means for you, as in not just you, Paul, but everybody who's listening or is on is working in the workforce today, right? Those people, the 50% of people that are at risk. What we've started doing, I guess you've started doing as a primary example, but everybody else has started doing, is they've started using AI in every day, right? They've decided that they can use, and I'm going to use the banned word of the day, ChatGPT, to help them with their business work. Now I'm going to call it business work for a second because I don't want to talk about IT, because I think it's easy to fall into IT and then talk about the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, and then start talking about, I'm a developer, I'm using Copilot for GitHub and it's doing code generation. I'm using cursor.com and I'm using it for writing my Python scripts, right? I actually this week literally sat there with the youngest who wants to go to university, and she said, I've got to do Pygame framework to create some games for work, for school, for college. And I said, okay, here's cursor.com. If you want to generate a game, which, is Hangman, you just type into the right-hand side, create me a Pygame, framework, and it then launches as, CGI kind of game, and you can play it. Or you can use Vim, or like they told you to do, at the bash command line, and create Python libraries and write it all yourself, and spend the next 5 weeks, 6 weeks building that graphical application, which I did when I was her same age on my Sinclair ZX, which my dad gave me a pile this big of basic, line 10, line 20, go to line 10. And I sat there and I said to her, oh, well, Dad, my friends are playing out on the street. Can I go and play? How do I save it? And he said, well, it's ROM. There is no storage on this system. So it had 2K on it, which was its memory. And so I was like, which I wouldn't have been able to do, this is why I'm not a developer, but I'd correctly entered those 2,000 lines of 58-page book to play Hangman, and made one mistake, which I would have done at the age of 15 or whatever it was, then it wouldn't have compiled anyway. So I don't know what I was thinking. And then now, you can get that same thing happening in 3 seconds, right? And so you kind of sat there going, why the education system asking you to learn the foundations, because you can be a programmer, but these tools aren't going away. These AI productivity tools are still going to be there. There'll be a question around whether or not you can read code. There may be a different question of whether you should be coding, but I'm going to move away from all that because that's the SDLC and it's boring and it's only, in essence, 10% operational cost of business. The 90% is what everyone does on a day-to-day basis, and they're the ones that are claim handlers, or they're, legal people, or they're accountants who are using these tools to go, oh well, I'll just ask ChatGPT, to draft me up a letter. And they look at it, even though they've got their, the pass the bar or whatever else they've done, or they're a doctor or whatever, and they look at the response and they go, that looks okay. And then they start relying on it, thinking that continuously it will always do that. And it'll never get to the point where it will make a mistake, which we know doctors make about 90% accuracy, which means 10%, I'm not going to say 10% of misdiagnosis, but they make mistakes. Humans make mistakes. If you can get to the point where it's higher than that 90%, which is kind of where we're nearly at with NLG, then suddenly there's a real problem about human replacement, right? So human replacement means AI literacy. And so that's the thing that comes into force as of 5 p.m. today, is it's saying, you remember, well, Paul does because he did his O-levels, but when you were doing your IT literacy or your computer literacy or your English literacy or math literacy, you had some foundational skills which you'd pass your O-level, then you show employers that you know enough to be able to string a sentence together, or you do your oral, your written or whatever else. This is the same thing. It's expecting that workforce, that 50% at risk workforce, on Tuesday, on Monday, to be able to have all of this structure around knowing there's some guidelines, there's some AI policies, to your point, some AI strategies, there's all of this other stuff in place that they're going to follow on a day-to-day basis, realizing that they should not, because it's illegal, be pushing out, confidential information about patient records to a large language model that's in the cloud, because you shouldn't be doing it, and then obviously it's a violation of GDPR and a number of other things. And these bans are going to come into force, not just for organizations that are building AI systems, but are building is staff that are in essence using these tools with a potential level of liability. So if you misdiagnose someone or you make a legal decision based on one of these systems like DeepMind, you could be potentially liable. And you go to the employee and say, well, where do you get this from? Oh, I got it from ChatGPT. Then, there's going to be some real concerns. And that happens on Monday. Now, I know you've got hopefully quite a bit to say about this around, all of these dimensions of fairness, governance, transparency, security, reliability, compliance with the regulations. And there is literally, if you go to AI Standards Hub, there is there's a new legislation for AI usage for education coming at what happened last week. There's so much, which I would say 90% of the workforce, well, 99% of the workforce don't even know exist. So how on earth do you, next week, even think about being able to think, well, I can't use ChatGPT, or I should not be using ChatGPT, or is ChatGPT or DeepMind ethical? Is it trustworthy? How do I know this stuff? And, where do I start?
That's about 10 questions, Jonathan.
That's what I wanted, 10 questions. So when my machine...
I'll make one observation. Being long in the tooth, when I did my degree in the 70s, late 70s, I was trying to suggest, I was looking for a project, like a second year project, because I did an engineering degree. And I got into computing, and I did a 2-week kind of Fortran course, 2 weeks to learn Fortran. But anyway, it was all new stuff then. And my tutor sort of said, he gave me this book, which was like, yay big. It had about 150 pages or something, which was an MSc thesis from one of his students from the late 50s. Right, so he was an old boy. He was a civil engineer, not a computer guy. He said, "Take a look at this, Paul. What do you think?" And it was basically 3 pages of basically some geometry and to do with a crane, and minimising the size of the engine required to drive a crane to load and unload stuff onto a ship, for example, or to do anything, to move anything from A to B. Anyway, it doesn't matter what it is. It's a geometrical problem. So this guy's MSc, bless him, was basically 3 pages of an explanation of the problem, and then 150 pages of 4-digit numbers. That was his MSc, and that was his program to optimize the the problem, the solution to the problem. So he said, "Take a look at this." So I thought, okay, well, I obviously, Jesus, this went on and on and on and on. And then the problem itself was kind of easily formulated into some Fortran code. I think it was about 80 or 90 lines of code, but it was just a hunting problem, looking for a minimum value. So you create a grid, you do the calculation for every spot on the grid, and whatever's the lowest, that's the optimum solution. End of problem. So I did that. That took it took a few days, put it lightly, because I was not an expert programmer in those days. I'm not an expert programmer now. Now, you could say, here's the problem, press the button, out pops the code, and probably with some careful, if you give it some test cases before you actually ask it to drop the code, it will, I hope, consider the situations that it's got to deal with. And this is exactly what I was explaining to you a bit earlier today, what I was doing yesterday. Giving some, in effect, let's figure out some test cases, now give me some code. And I think test-driven development works better with AI if you are going to use the code. Anyway, the problem now, that problem like that can now be, I think, as good as solved in, 20 minutes, And so the rate of increase is just incredible. Now, to your point, is it ethical for it to tackle problems at all, trustworthily, if that's the right thing? That's the big challenge we've got. Now, I'm not going to say yes or no to that. That's the problem we have. How do we answer the question, can we trust this system, this service, these features of AI that we use in our conventional systems, let's say, or maybe safety-critical systems like flying aeroplanes and helicopters, for heaven's sakes, it's going to end up in those, if it's not already in those kind of systems, well, going in that direction. Regrettably, you could say, regrettably, the accident that happened last night or the night before. Anyway, the EU directive, which I've not read cover to cover or page to page, but my impression of it is it looks like it's very worthy. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing in there I would disagree with, but it looks like a standard for ethically and professionally managing your employees. If you substitute the word employee or team member or human being for where it says AI and this, that and the other, you'd say this is perfectly reasonable. Like, you need to give them a plan, you need to make them aware of risks and get them to consider risks, you need to get them to be transparent and open. Honestly, that was the impression I was left with, and I thought, well, this is great. This would be really helpful to add to the, I can't remember what it's called now, but the Declaration of Human Rights and all the labour, as in working people's directive. That might be what it's called. It's an adjunct to that. That'd be fantastic. Then it would be complete. Anyway, so how do you enforce that? Well, blow me. A lot of these things are not checkbooks kind of thing. I mean, somebody will come up with a checklist and then start charging an arm and a leg to compare people. Just ask questions. Do you do this? Yes. Tick. Okay. We're nearly there. Tick, 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 and so on. And then where you don't have a tick, you then get an offer of consultancy to help you get that tick in the box. Well, we've been through that loop many times. Some companies are comfortable taking that kind of approach on because they regard adhering to a standard, any standard, is a box-ticking exercise. That's not the way to look at it, we all know, and yet many industries spend time doing that. I've lost track of what your question was now. I hope I've kind of prattled on long enough. But remind me what was the thing you wanted me to answer?
No. I think that was fine. I think part of it is I know you did want to talk a little bit about where these fall short, right? And I had this slide which I put up the other day, which was like, okay, these different frameworks around explainability of AI and what it does. There's the different AI TRISM kind of frameworks around governance and trustworthiness and stuff that people should be doing, right? And I think, there's so much noise in the industry at the moment around large language models and generative AI. It's quite hard to see the AI through the large language models when you're talking about traditional ML and AI systems which we've been developing maybe 20 years plus in modern software development. The cognitive engineering side of things, building systems that make decisions. You gave the flight example one. I was listening yesterday. Obviously, the Boeing have just been a really bad year because the doors keep on falling off the planes on a certain model, right? And you look at it and you question, the same way we gave the example with, NASA being CMMI level 5, and then, then SpaceX comes, disrupts the industry, makes the payload be able to land again. And then, NASA pivots down to level 3, and maybe Boeing's doing something similar to be able to keep up with engine as a service provided by other players. That then things happen, and then these huge fines come through. Huge fines because, well, the door came off at takeoff. Slight problem, especially if people die, right? And I think this is the problem for people who are box ticking that 42,000 is probably because they're in industries which could potentially be liable for lawsuits of, misconduct and liability claims, right? And I think that's fine. Aerospace, healthcare, medical, military, all of those quite easily, fall under the category. And if we were being realistic for a second, they're really 90% of the world, right? The ones that are little e-commerce businesses, you could even potentially argue that Amazon and Alphabet and everyone else are now tech companies, right? The byproducts of what they do is very small when it comes to the traditional e-commerce, retail, smaller subset organizations. They may be big revenue generators, but again, they're tech companies, right? And if every company's a tech company and all of them are really on this journey of AI, and they're doing it with people who are genuinely just doing what you just said, which is their employees are going what I call shadow prompting or shadow AI. They're just going off and doing whatever they want because they think throwing Copilot for GitHub is the solution, when we already know, and I'm meeting Diego next week, he already said there's stats coming of 400% worse code coverage, code quality problems since people started using generative tools because, like I did yesterday, it took 3 seconds to create a game. It ran. It allowed you to play Hangman. You didn't know what the code was. You didn't have to go to GitHub and read all these different code repositories and try to figure out what they did. You just say to Cursor, write me an application. And you don't know whether or not it meets all the requirements that your business does. Now, of course, the smarter ones will probably be taking user stories, acceptance criteria, and hopefully going all the way back to requirements engineering to make sure that what they're building is the right thing. But I would say 90% of the software engineers that I work with don't do that, right? And so, I think with Agile and Lean and all the other stuff that's kind of come through, I think software engineering is a lost discipline. And therefore, with engineering of systems rigor is still relied for mission critical and critical infrastructure and healthcare and everything else, that I think these methodologies are just not fit for purpose. They're great for creating manufacturing production lines for Toyota and stuff, but software development's a different beast. So I don't think we're there yet.
No.
And I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience, and I say that both of them came from Nico so far. But Nico kind of said, well, how does DeepMind compare to other models? Now, interestingly, we partially had a disagreement this morning around how good DeepMind is compared to ChatGPT.
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek. Okay.
DeepSeek. DeepSeek R1 versus OpenAI O1, right? So, part of it is, obviously, I put out that yesterday to say there's nothing exciting about DeepSeek. It's, in a way, it's the only thing that's interesting is what we talked about earlier, which was the lowering of costs for training models, and the memory space that's required for inference. That's really the big change. Now, interestingly, I also said the exact same thing, is that it's lowered the barrier of entry for people who were learning prompt engineering, who weren't familiar with chain of thought already, that it feels like it's brought chain of thought to the masses. And it absolutely has, right? It's brought chain of thought to the masses, and behind chain of thought is people believe for a second that what they're doing is it's now using reasoning, right? And it is absolutely doing reasoning, right? Because what in essence it's doing is it's doing prompt threading, and it's going through, and when you ask a question like, how do I, create a stormtrooper, build a stormtrooper, it would then have some design principles in the instruct model that would say, okay, first talk about what components are required, talk about, well, how would I do any building activity, what things should I be thinking about, how would I prepare. So in a way, it's got the reinforcement learning, all the extra stuff that they put on top of the model that allows it to start coming up with, well, first I'd do this, and then I would do that, and then I would do this. And the chain of thought prompting or prompt threading is acting like it's a person going through thinking. And it suddenly means that the normal everyday Joe is kind of going, oh, well, yeah, I'm getting better results, right? Now, we could look at both of them, and I spent a bit of time this morning with doing some chain of thought stuff on O1, and then over here I've got a Llama DeepSeek R1 running on this machine, 8 billion, and I can tell you with a shadow of doubt, the 8 billion model is awful, right? It's really not effective. Now, the DeepSeek platform with the full 13 times by 110 billion Minstrel of Experts DeepMind R1 version is good and is better. I'm going to use the word better across the line than OpenAI is. So if you are using the mobile app or you are using the web version, then you're probably right? DeepSeek R1 would beat O1 for OpenAI and chain of reasoning. However, I think there's still an argument to be said that it's down. It's in the eye of the beholder. It depends how good your prompts are. Like, you're good because we've been teaching a whole stack of skills this year around Socratic test questioning. You go through a logical process, with the defo spam stuff that you've been developing, and you're very structured. I would partially argue if you're a 90% workforce person in the business, that actually DeepSeek would probably give you more confidence that what you're doing is correct, and would still have a low level of, we know because we look at the output and we validate it and we go through these different levels of rigor. But if you ask a bad question, you get a bad response. And I think, you may have gone on a prompt training course, you might have gone on an ISTQB course, but that doesn't make you a tester. It doesn't make you a prompt engineer, the ones that get paid 400k a year. So I would say,
Well, I want one of those jobs.
I know I do as well. But, part of it is, forget the prompt improver and stuff for Anthropic and stuff for a second. I know personally, and this is me, even with 3-4 years of doing development of large language models and generative AI systems and prompt threading, prompt tuning, going through all of this, prompt engineering practices, visualization of thought, chain of thought, reasoning, all that kind of stuff, I still feel that I would not be the right person to create a prompt. I would say that I would rather throw it to somebody in the business who's got the business acumen, who's able to understand the sources of knowledge, not just me chuck the sources of knowledge and sources of information and sources of industry in. I still think human intelligence is king, and if you find someone who's smart and understands their industry, and they've given the right framework, like defo spam, that actually they could be incredibly productive. And the rigor, and to kind of Nico's kind of question is, it could balance that, creativity and factual accuracy in responses with the toxicity scores and fluidity scores and the ML ops over the top of it, that you could actually kind of say to yourself, this could feed into an agentic workflow, and I could be quite consistently able to go peer review this factual response back with somebody who's smart, who understands copywriting or whatever else, and they'd be able to glance through it, spot the issue, and then they'd be able to move it into the next process to somebody who's an accessibility expert, who would then check the accessibility angle, and actually human collaboration would suddenly go through the roof, and the AI productivity of 30% could be realized, which when we say 30% productivity, what we're really saying is we want to sack 30% of your workforce and make them redundant, right? Which is why they want to get to that magical 50% of the UK workforce that, in theory, are primed, ready to be reduced. So I'm handing this back to you, even though I know, we've got a lot more around, some of the big, I wanted to leave with two big things, which before we disappear in 5-10 minutes, and I want you to summarize everything in your side. But the Code of Practice comes in play May the 2nd this year. The UK Liability Directive comes in August 2nd, right? There's some major enforcement stuff that's coming in August 2nd. I'm doing this next week. I need to promote this. Is the BCS. We're doing a book tour thing, talking about the AI book that I did around building trustworthy systems. A lot of this I'm going to be covering on that session next week, but it feels like you're right. An AI governance framework feels like any other framework that any other governance framework, just find and replace the word AI. And there's a whole stack of excited people at EY and all these high value consultancy companies that would be happy to take your money and put you through a rigorous system that feels like they've just replaced big data with AI, or digital transformation with AI transformation, and charged you a large amount of money. But I'll end with the statement, which is the fines which are coming in place on that August 2nd day is 7% global turnover, or 35 million. Feels very similar to the GDPR thing, which never really felt like it fined the right people. It's a lot worse in the US because they can stop you trading. I think, this should be a real thing. It should be on everyone's mind, whether or not you're talking about AI literacy of your staff and your workforce and enabling them with training, which I just don't think has happened. I think everyone's using these tools without proper education. And then secondly, for the ones that are building cutting edge AI infused systems, I think you've not got the policies, the strategy, the governance, the auditability, the frameworks that are required to be compliant or regulatory, align with the regulators, ready for those days. I think we're probably 2-3 years behind that, and I think the 42,000 standard and everything else we talked about, I think there's a handful of people that are following that. I think 90% aren't. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this AI assurance landscape, for at least the next 5 years. So I'll let you summarize out your fight.
Thank you.
Try and close this off in AI assurance.
Good heavens. Well, the things I don't know why I've misplaced my pencil. My good old pencil has disappeared, so I couldn't write down what I was going to say. So off the top of my head, the first thing I would say is, you said that, for example, DeepSeek, the 8 billion model, it's no good, whatever. It is what it is. It's a cut down version of a much larger model, and which is effective. And I think it's on a par with the best of OpenAI's offering. But who cares? Because in a year's time, that'll all be history anyway, because that'll be swept away by the next generation. And the thing is, when we talk about people, we think of generations in 20, 25 years, or maybe, some around that. And when we talk about generations of software, we're probably looking at 3 to 5 years. Well, generations in the AI world now are like, what's new this week? It's not a weekly thing, but there are hundreds of products and models and apps, whatever, being released weekly, which are moving the industry forward. Whether in the right direction or not, that's another debate, but it's moving so quickly. So how on earth can we, as wearing the QA assurance tester's hat, whatever, how can we keep pace with that? Because the technology isn't the problem. It's the application and the insights required from that technology that are driving decision making in our systems, and that's the problem we've got, is how do we trust them? So that's the bad news. It's changing so quick. The good news is, I don't think, though, I'm going to go back to my old hobby horse, which is, if we regard the AI as doing some of our thinking for us and some of the legwork in terms of calculations and analysis and research and extraction of information from their training data or RAG content, that's not changed. That's not changing. So firstly, it is a moving target, but we've got to focus on the things that don't move and then do the best we can with that. I think that's one thing to say. What was the next thing I was going to say? I've completely lost my mind. I'm going to struggle now because I'm on the spot. What was I going to say? I had some really interesting things to say about 15 minutes ago, and then you talked and talked. I apologise. I'm only human, I'm afraid. Geez. Oh yeah, log tables. Yeah, I was thinking about, yeah. So education has a problem right now. Education. So your partner's daughters are, where they're at, and my partner's daughter also is a student as well, and she's studying English and various other things. And I said the obvious thing is, well, why don't you use AI? And he said, well, we're banned from using it except for very specific purposes. And I said, sure. But it reminds me of like the days when I learned how to use log tables. So to use natural logarithms, to look up the log of a number, use that in some calculations, simple calculations, to do complicated calculations. Let's leave it at that. And at that time, calculators were banned from examination rooms. Now, before that, it would have been the case that slide rules were banned from examination rooms. Now, AI is banned, whatever. And yet, in the workplace, the first thing you're going to be presented with is, here's our AI-driven system, you're going to have to use it. So the day will come when AI is part and parcel of what an academic institution will say, this is part of our toolkit. They've got to do that because they're at odds with the workforce, the labour market, the economy itself, you could say. So education has a massive rethink to do. I don't think there'll be no universities in future, and everybody will be doing it online. But they've got to rethink what universities are for. Now, that is a real challenge for them. And I think in parallel, every industry has to take account of the fact that AI is going to change the way they do business and what they are for. Like anyone, so why would you hire a lawyer if all cases are loaded up into an AI model and you can search for any precedents, because our legal system is based on precedent. You don't need lawyers anymore. So why the hell would you have a lawyer? So lawyers have to right now it's a bit like estate agents. They're all using AI for their own internal purposes. But I'm just waiting for lawyer.ai, and anyone can look up put in their situation and get legal advice. Why do you need lawyers anymore? In the same way that probably medicine is a bit further ahead, you can just go to ChatGPT and say, I've got these symptoms, what have I got? What's my problem? And you trust it or not trust it, you can actually try it, can't you? So there's a massive societal problem. It's not a technical problem at all. The technology is racing away, and this time next year we'll be having different conversations. Assurance will still be on the table. I'm not saying that. But the models we use to example what we're saying will be all different. Yeah. There'll be different models, and there'll be some tools now which do really clever things. Like they're really clever now, but they'll be really, really clever. And there doesn't seem to be any end in sight yet. Maybe in 10 years' time it'll stabilise, but not right now. So the challenge of assurance is keeping pace with the thinking, but not getting distracted by the technology. I think that the challenge of all industries is, what is your industry about? Are you in the right business? I think the mantra, if you're not, AI is going to take your job, but it'll be taken by someone who's using AI if you're not, kind of thing. That's a bit trite. No, I'm not.
Well, no, because that's the only quote I've got, which I put on my slides, and then anyone quotes me back. So
it's too simplistic.
That's what I'm saying. A human meeting now, so I'm going to go anyway. So we're going to end up the live stream. But I think that was a good summary, right? Yeah. And to the people who said,
sorry, the impression I've got, having had day-long conversations with ChatGPT a couple of days ago and DeepSeek yesterday about designing software. It's incredible that you can start a conversation by talking about goals and the mission of what you're trying to do, and then looking at architecture, and then you look at some of the challenges, and this is the AI telling me what the challenges are. It's doing most of the legwork here, and then going down and say, well, how could we build a prototype to do this? And then we can say, how could we test this prototype, whatever. And to have those conversations in a day where it would normally take weeks and weeks with 25 people being involved, all having their say, means that, like, a one-man band like you or me can build some pretty clever stuff, design some pretty clever stuff very quickly. Implementing the code, that's still tough. It can generate code, but you still got to think through and test it and whatever. But, I'm working on it, so... I'm having great fun, but it's the fact that it can have conversations at the very highest level and down and dirty at the code level. That's it's absolutely remarkable. You know. Now you're still got to treat it as someone who knows 90% of the problem, not the 100%, and still have that caution. But I'm still optimistic, you know. And you've just got to, that 10% is like the 10% of code that doesn't work in any system. It causes it to be completely useless. You've still got to pay attention to that. And that's why I think we'll still need testers, we'll still need good designers, we'll still need good programmers, we'll still need users who know what they want, etc., etc., etc. So,
and AI assurance, right? More importantly,
Yeah,
so I'm going to leave on that AI assurance